It seemed to me that I was calm and totally unafraid of losing my free life. I had finished with that a long time ago. It was not even a life anymore, but some kind of limbo, which I wanted to end as soon as possible. I was oppressed by the thought of the following morning, that hour at the governor's when he would suddenly approach in earnest. I was sure of success. Everything would take place without the slightest hitch. It shouldn't be hard at all, and not at all frightening. But nevertheless, I felt mortally unhappy. I had not expected this feeling. At the same time, I was not excited, but tired. I even felt sleepy. But as soon as I fell asleep, I had a nightmare. It seemed to me that I was not sleeping, but lying on my back looking through the glass above the door, which was illuminated from the corridor. Suddenly I felt as if I were losing my mind. Something was irresistibly forcing me to rise, to go out into the corridor, and there to scream. I knew this was mad. I tried to hold myself back with all my strength, and yet nevertheless I went into the corridor and screamed and screamed. Masha, who was lying next to me, woke me up. I was indeed screaming, but on my cot and not in the corridor. Again I fell asleep, and again I had the same dream. Against my will, I walked out and screamed. I knew it was crazy, but nevertheless I screamed. So it went several times. Then it was time to get up. We had no watches, but the sky had begun to turn gray, and someone knocked at our landlady's door. We had to hurry to Trepov's before 9 o'clock, before he began to receive petitioners. We rose silently in the cold semi-darkness. I put on a new dress. My coat and hat were old. After dressing, I left the room. A new cloak and hat lay in the traveling bag, and I would change into them at the station. This was necessary because the landlady would certainly want to say goodbye. She would praise the cloak and advise me not to wear it on the road. And tomorrow this cloak would be in all the newspapers and might draw her attention. I had had time to think about everything, down to the most petty details. It was already growing light, but the half-dark station was completely deserted. I changed, exchanged kisses with Masha, and left. The streets looked cold and gloomy. About 10 petitioners had already gathered at the governor's. Is the governor receiving? He's receiving. He'll be right out. A woman, poorly dressed, with eyes red from weeping, sat down near me and asked me to take a look at her petition. Is this how they're written here? Then there was some sort of discrepancy in the petition. I advised her to show it to the officer, since I saw that he was already looking something over. She was afraid and asked me to show it to him. I went up to the officer with the petitioner and directed his attention to her. My voice was ordinary. There was no sign of my agitation. I was satisfied. The nightmarish feeling that had weighed on me since the previous evening was gone without a trace. I had nothing on my mind but the concern that everything should go as planned. The adjutant led us into the next room, me first, and put us in a corner. At this very moment, Trepov entered from another door with a whole retinue of military men, and all of them headed toward me. For a moment, this confused and upset me. In thinking through the details, I found it inconvenient to shoot at the moment I presented the petition. Now Trepov and his entourage were looking at me, their hands occupied by papers and things, and I decided to do it earlier than I had planned, to do it when Trepov stopped opposite my neighbor, before reaching me. And suddenly there was no neighbor ahead of me. I was first. It's all the same. I will shoot when he stops next to the petitioner after me, I cried inwardly. The momentary alarm passed at once, as if it had never been. What do you want? A certificate of conduct. He jotted down something with a pencil and turned to my neighbor. The revolver was in my hand. I pressed the trigger. A misfire. My heart missed a beat. Again I pressed. A shot. Cries. Now they'll start beating me. This was next in the sequence of events I had thought through so many times. But instead, there was a pause. It probably lasted only a few seconds in all, but I felt it. I threw down the revolver. This had also been decided beforehand. Otherwise, in the scuffle, it might go off by itself. I stood and waited. The criminal was stunned, they wrote later in the papers. Suddenly, everyone around me began moving. The petitioners scattered, police officers threw themselves at me, and I was seized from both sides. Where is the gun? She threw it. It's on the floor. The revolver. Give up the revolver. They continued to scream, pulling me in different directions. A person appeared before me. His eyes were completely round, and his wide open mouth issued a snarl, not a scream. His two huge hands, the fingers crooked, were headed directly for my eyes. I shut them as tightly as I could, and he only skinned my cheeks. Blows rained down. They rolled me around and continued to beat me. Everything went as I had expected. The only additional thing was the attack of my eyes. But now I lay with my face to the floor, and they were out of danger. I felt not the slightest pain, however, and this surprised me. I felt pain only that night, when they finally locked me in the cell. You're beating her. Already killed, it seems. You can't do that. Stop. We must have an investigation. A battle began around me. Someone was pushed away. They helped me up and sat me in a chair. It seemed to me that this was the room in which I had presented my petition. But in front of me, somewhat to the left, near the wall, there was a wide staircase without landings, which went to the very top of the opposite wall. People were hurrying down it, pushing one another and making noise and shouting. This riveted my attention immediately. How did the staircase get there? It seemed as if it hadn't been there earlier, as if it were somehow unreal, and the people unreal too. Perhaps it's only my imagination passed through my mind immediately. But then they led me to another room, and so the riddle of the staircase was never solved. For some reason, I recalled it all day long, whenever I was left in peace for a minute. The room into which I was led was large, much larger than the first. Large desks stood near one of the walls. A wide bench ran along another. There were a few people in the room at the moment, none at all from the governor's retinue. Meanwhile, the news had evidently already spread to higher circles. The room began to fill up. One after another, military and civilian bigwigs arrived, and with more or less threatening looks headed toward me. A loud, energetic officer was in command. He called 2 soldiers with bayonets on their rifles, stood them behind me, and ordered them to hold my hands. He went to the center of the room, looked around, and evidently not liking this position, moved to another. As he walked, he warned the soldiers, "Be careful, or else she might stick a knife into you." My foresight, and consequently my precise plan of action, did not extend beyond the moment of attack. But every minute, my joy increased. Not because I was in full control of myself, there was the matter of the staircase, but rather because I found myself in an extraordinary state of the most complete invulnerability, such as I had never before experienced. Nothing at all could confuse me, annoy me, or tire me. Whatever was being thought up by those men at that time, conversing animatedly in another corner of the room, I would regard them calmly from a distance they could not cross.